So as you know, my name is Elisa Graffi. I'm the director of the SEEK project and a professor at Arizona State University. And one of the reasons that we're including this session on climate interventions is that for people that have been very interested in issues of adaptation and resilience and energy transitions and climate change and responses to the climate crisis, one issue that has been off of most people's radar screens until very recently is the idea that it may not be enough to simply stop using fossil fuels, that actions may require some additional um, ideas, and that there are ethical implications and technological feasibility implications of those. Many of these strategies, and there are quite a few, have been discussed in small circles of people, mostly on the technology side, to some degree on the ethical and legal side. But these notions are still not widely understood. There isn't a lot of public awareness about a lot of them. And we want to bring that into the discussion. Will and I have been working together for several years on these issues. He's a specialist in a variety of topics related to potential climate interventions. And what we're going to do is have him go through these things, and then we'll talk about some of the scientific and ethical aspects of them. We'll talk about how they're being understood in terms of the public framing, and just get into a discussion. You can ask any questions that you would like. So with that, let me introduce Will Burns, who is a professor of research at American University and is the founder and co-director of two different organizations. I'll let him tell you about them. One having to do with geoengineering, the other having to do with law and policy related to carbon dioxide removal in particular. And he will then explain to us what some of these strategies are and give us a little bit of context around them. Will?
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to, at the outset, thank Elisa and the students for inviting me and organizing this workshop. As Elisa had indicated, I am co-director of a research center at American University called the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law, and Policy, which looks at one of the categories that we'll talk about today that fall under the broader rubric of geoengineering, which is carbon removal. And we have a sister organization that focuses on the other major category, which we'll also talk about today. So I'll just launch right into it and then leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So as all of you know, the Paris Agreement to address medium-term and long-term climate policymaking entered into force in 2016. And the highlight of that agreement was establishing temperature targets for the first time in an international agreement. And so Paris called for the parties to the agreement to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius and at least aspirationally, try to hold temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, because there was an acknowledgement that this tracked the scientific consensus that when we pass those critical thresholds, very serious implications occur, both in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. Unfortunately, the pledges that the countries have made to date, these are called nationally determined contributions under the treaty, do not put us on track for holding temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Indeed, the most recent projections are that those pledges would result in temperature increases of somewhere between 3.2 and 3.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And because of the inertia of the system, even when we totally decarbonize the world's economy, temperatures will continue to rise for hundreds of years thereafter. Moreover, the other thing that we know from recent reports are that even these pretty tepid commitments that parties have made are not really being complied with by most of the countries involved. And so there's increasing concern as we pass the 2 degrees Celsius threshold and we start to get into the 3 to 4 degrees Celsius threshold, some extremely serious implications will occur. For example, if temperatures rise by 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, it could melt the Greenland ice sheet. And the melting of that ice sheet alone would raise sea level by more than 20 feet. Now, the good news is it might take 1,000 years for that to happen. The bad news is that once we pass that threshold, we are stuck with that sea level rise for thousands of years thereafter. If temperatures rise by 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, it's predicted that all of the world's coral reefs will disappear. And these provide critical subsistence for about a third of all of the species that are found in the world's oceans. If temperatures rise by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, 40 to 60% of the world's species could be threatened with extinction, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If temperatures rise by 3 degrees Celsius or more, there may be substantial reductions in crops, especially in some of the most vulnerable countries in the global south. And there's also serious economic and health implications associated with temperature increases of this magnitude. So the specter of climate change at this level has led to increasing interest in another kind of intervention to address climate change, which falls under the broad definition of climate geoengineering. And I just want to start off with a working definition. The Oxford Geoengineering Program defines this as deliberate, large scale interventions in the Earth's natural systems to try to counteract climate change. And when we talk about climate geoengineering, we usually divide it into two broad categories. The first of these categories is what we call solar radiation management, or SRM. These are techniques that seek to reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation. We call that the insolation. Okay. Now the idea is if there is less solar radiation to be trapped by the greenhouse gases that humans are emitting, it will exert a cooling impact. The second approach is radically different. It's called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. The idea here is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by removing some of that CO2 and either storing it, such as in saline aquifers or abandoned coal mines or in the world's oceans, or seeking to utilize it, such as for production of energy or high strength materials or pharmaceuticals. And the idea here is if there are less of these greenhouse gases to trap the outgoing solar radiation, again, it exerts a cooling impact. Now, until recently, these kinds of options were kind of akin to one's crazy old uncle that shows up at holiday parties and babbles about things that nobody else understands or wants to hear about. But more recently, largely out of desperation, we've invited this uncle to the table to potentially weigh in on what the world needs to do in terms of climate change. And given kind of the steadily growing drumbeats for climate geoengineering research and potential deployment, I think it's important to discuss some of these options. So what I'm going to try to do is very briefly go through the primary approaches, both under solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal, that are being discussed in terms of potential risks and benefits, and then briefly talk about how we're trying to govern these approaches at the international level. So first of all, I want to talk about the solar radiation management options that we're looking at. The first of these is called sulfur aerosol injection. And if you've ever heard of any kind of geoengineering, this is probably the one that you've heard discussed. The idea here is to inject sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere, which, when they combine with water vapor, create sulfate aerosols. And these aerosol particles are extremely reflective and thus would reflect some of the incoming solar radiation back to space and keep them from being trapped by greenhouse gases in the troposphere. Um, Recent studies have indicated that you could put enough of these particles into the air to reduce insolation, the amount of incoming solar radiation, by about 1.85%, which would be enough to return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels and do it very quickly. Okay. Um, those are the potential benefits, but there's a lot of risks associated with this approach. One is by cooling the stratosphere, you're likely to substantially change evaporation in many parts of the world, which in turn could substantially reduce the amount of precipitation. Uh, in some areas, such as Southeast Asia, for example, could reduce precipitation by as much as 30%. And this might imperil the monsoon in some regions, potentially substantially weakening it or even shutting it down. And the monsoon is responsible for precipitation that protects the food of more than 1 billion people. And this could also happen in other areas, such as the Amazonian regions of South America. Another risk is that you could see substantial depletion of the ozone layer because you now have new foundations for the ozone depleting substances to break down the ozone layer. And some studies say that it could delay recovery of that ozone layer by 50 to 70 years, which could mean millions of additional cases of skin cancer and many thousands of additional cases of deaths associated with skin cancer. Um, if you also ever stopped using this technology, all of that buildup of greenhouse gases in the interim would now essentially rush into the system, and you could see temperature increases many times greater than if you did nothing and very rapidly, right? We call that determination effect. A second approach that we're looking at is something called marine cloud brightening. The idea is to spray salt water into low-level maritime clouds, which would increase their nucleation and make them more reflective. And some studies indicate that you could put enough of these particles into the clouds to stabilize temperatures where they are now. But many studies have indicated that we're not certain if this would work. Some say it could substantially increase the brightening of the clouds. Others say it has very little impact, and some say that it could even darken the clouds, meaning that more incoming radiation would be captured, which would exert a warming impact. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this context. Risks include, again, shutting down precipitation substantially in many parts of the world. Also, by reducing the amount of sunlight, it might have negative impacts in terms of phytoplankton production, which are at the foundation of the food chain in the world's oceans, and other biogeochemical feedbacks that might be negative. And then the last solar radiation management approach we talk about are space-based. These are the idea of building satellites and putting giant mirrors on those satellites to reflect incoming radiation back to space. Uh, this is an approach that would be extremely expensive, cost about $5 trillion initially, and then in costs associated with maintenance also. Uh, and the effectiveness of this approach remains also contested and largely just modeled. Okay, let's look on the other side of the equation. These are carbon dioxide removal approaches. And many studies now, as illustrated in this chart, indicate that if we're going to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, we may need to not only continue to aggressively decarbonize the economy, but we may need to store as much as 15 to 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year by sucking it out of the atmosphere. So, what are some of the approaches that would allow us to remove carbon from the atmosphere? One that's widely discussed is called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The idea is to use bioenergy feedstocks such as trees or residues from crops or dedicated energy crops to produce energy for fuels or electricity or heat, and then to capture the carbon dioxide that's released in the flue gas from burning these biostocks, and uh, and uh, and then store that carbon dioxide. This is called a negative emissions technology because the growing of the feedstocks results in a take up of carbon dioxide, and then the carbon dioxide that's released is uh, is captured, and then more bioenergy feedstocks are grown. BECCS has the potential to potentially again substantially reduce concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, maybe by 25 to 50%. But it also has risks. It's likely that you would have to divert large amounts of croplands, maybe as much as a third of them, for dedicated energy crops to make the system work at a very large scale. And if you were to take all of that cropland out of harvest, it could increase food prices for the world's most vulnerable peoples by as much as 30 to 40%. It also could require as much water as all the water we currently use for irrigation on Earth. And that's at a time where there's increasing demands for water. And it could have negative biodiversity impacts, maybe as much as increasing temperatures by 2.8 degrees Celsius. So, not much different than what we'd see anyway. Uh, Forestation, planting trees is another idea. Uh, Again, when you plant trees, they take up carbon dioxide. But there's a lot of challenges in this context also, including the fact that many of the areas that you would plant trees in, such as savannas and grasslands, have huge biodiversity, and we would lose that biodiversity. We also have questions about the permanence of this approach, especially with climate change. As we've seen in areas such as Australia and California in recent years, forest fires have resulted in a massive loss of trees. And as climate change becomes more serious, it's questionable whether an approach that seeks to sequester carbon would do well under those circumstances. Another approach is direct air capture. The idea is to channel ambient air through filters that would use things such as calcium hydroxide or lye to separate out carbon dioxide that could then be pressurized into a liquid form that could be shipped for storage. Direct air capture potentially could capture enough carbon again to return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels. But there's challenges in this context. One is cost. Some think it could cost as much as $600 to $1,000 per ton of carbon captured, but some recent efforts by companies may bring that price down to less than $100. But we'll see. They're all seeking to build pilot plants right now to test that proposition. There's also the threat of citizen resistance to having carbon dioxide in these kind of levels stored under their land, for example. We call that NUMBY as opposed to NIMBY, not under my backyard. And that could result in massive lawsuits and delay in implementing this approach. Another approach is called biochar, and uh, and this seeks to uh, burn biomass and under in high temperatures under conditions of low oxygen, which produces the charcoal, which will hold carbon dioxide for perhaps 500 years or more. And then that biochar could be spread on croplands, where it could also result in substantial increases in yield. Uh, However, studies indicate that biochar's effectiveness is widely contestable. Some say you might at most store less than a gigaton of carbon dioxide through this approach, while others say perhaps as much as 9 gigatons. And so, additional research is necessary in this context. Moreover, in some areas, uh, biochar could increase the releases of other more potent greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide. So we'd have to very closely characterize the areas in which we were to place biochar to ensure that we get the benefits without the risks. Another approach that we're talking about is called enhanced weathering. Over thousands of years, all of the carbon dioxide on Earth is sequestered through minerals taking up that CO2, those that are high in silicates. And the idea here is to grind up some of these silicate rocks, such as olivine, for example, and increase their reactive surfaces in a way that speeds up that process massively, right? Some studies indicate that enhanced weathering could store as much as 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, which would be about a quarter, perhaps, or a fifth of all the CO2 we'd have to store. But it could be extremely costly, more than $400 per ton. There's also questions associated with inhalation of these materials if they're finely ground. And also, as these would ultimately end up in the world's oceans, there's questions about potential ecosystem impacts that would occur. The last of these that I highlight is something called ocean iron fertilization. The idea here is to find areas of the world's oceans that have a shortage of iron, which limits the amount of phytoplankton that can be produced. Phytoplankton take up carbon dioxide. They convert inorganic carbon to carbon, uh, and uh, and the idea here is that if you could increase phytoplankton production by seeding certain areas with iron, you'd have more phytoplankton. They would take up more carbon dioxide, and a portion of that carbon dioxide would sink to the bottom of the ocean for storage when the phytoplankton species died. Some studies indicated this could be as much as 25% of all the CO2 in the atmosphere, but more recent studies based on some field research indicate that it's probably a lot less, maybe 10% or 5% of the CO2 could be removed from the atmosphere, but still worthy of consideration. But there's also risks associated with this approach. If you produce phytoplankton species that the zooplankton in the area can't consume, you could have a what we call a biological trophic cascade, right, where the zooplankton species decline, and then the species that rely on them, such as higher order mammals, would have food shortages. We're also worried that this could produce lots of methane and nitrous oxides as the phytoplankton die and take up oxygen, and that could result in a net increase in warming. We're also worried that some of these phytoplankton might produce toxic uh, 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 reference uh, reference particles, which could also have highly negative impacts in terms of ocean ecosystems. So that's a brief overview of these approaches. And then uh, more briefly, there have been some efforts recently to regulate these approaches. One treaty called the London Dumping Convention looked at ocean iron fertilization and indicated that the parties to that treaty should only allow ocean iron fertilization experiments if it's for legitimate scientific research. In other words, no selling of credits, for example, in the voluntary markets or under the Kyoto Protocol for that kind of research. It indicated that it also should be only done when a risk assessment framework is utilized to look at the potential costs and benefits of that research. Uh, the dumping convention's efforts to regulate these approaches we've talked about, however, is limited. First of all, these resolutions aren't legally binding on the parties. And second of all, more importantly, this only regulates placement of materials in the oceans. And so a lot of these approaches we talked about, like bioenergy with carbon capture or sulfur aerosol injection, would not be regulated under this treaty. Another treaty regime that's looked at geoengineering is the Convention on Biological Diversity. It passed a resolution in 2010 that essentially calls for the same things as under the London Convention, only small scale research, only for scientific purposes and with risk assessment. But again, these resolutions are not binding. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has not been particularly good at even addressing loss of biodiversity. And so taking on this complex new topic, it's questionable whether it really has the expertise or capacity to regulate these things. Moreover, it focuses only on protection of biodiversity. So some of the impacts that we're talking about, such as loss of food resources, for example, for humans, would not fall under the rubric of this treaty. In the longer term, probably the logical place to be regulating these things is under the climate agreements, right? Because presumably, if we're to engage in climate geoengineering, it would be one of the three legs of the stools to address climate change. The first being traditional mitigation efforts to reduce emissions, adaptation, and then climate geoengineering. So presumably, we want to coordinate those three responses within the climate regime. So one question is whether the climate regime could regulate all of these approaches. And if you look at Article 4 of both, which provides the scope of what the parties are to do, it calls for mitigation of climate change, which it defines as limiting emissions and protecting and enhancing sinks. Sinks are things that take up carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide removal approaches seem to clearly fall within the rubric of these regimes, right? It could be a mitigation response that the countries could engage in. Solar radiation management, it's more questionable, right? It doesn't seek to reduce the amount of emissions, but rather the amount of incoming solar radiation, and it doesn't seek to enhance sinks, things that take up carbon dioxide. So one wonders if the climate regimes could even regulate these approaches. However, there is other language in both the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention that might allow this. Article 3 of the Framework Convention talks about protecting the climate system. And so, if some of these approaches, such as sulfur aerosol injection, might adversely impact precipitation, one might argue that the parties could intervene to seek to regulate these approaches. Similarly, the Paris Agreement emphasizes that we're to look at not only the impacts of climate change, but also the impacts of response measures, things that we seek to utilize to reduce climate change. And to that extent, we might argue that solar radiation management could be regulated by the parties. Um, and I want to stop there to have time for questions. But I think the last thing that I would emphasize is as the manifestations of climate change become more serious, uh, and given the fact that we're probably not going to get our act together to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we come closer and closer to passing these critical thresholds we've talked about, it's likely the drumbeats for climate geoengineering interventions are going to become louder. And these approaches, as I've indicated, raise a lot of serious issues in terms of potential impacts on the environment, potential impacts on human, all of which raise issues of values, including social justice and equity that are germane to everyone, including obviously communities of faith, as well as questions of whether climate geoengineering could be considered a form of stewardship or if it flies in the face of notions of stewardship and notions of control by human beings of profound changes in the climate. These are issues that we'll all have to grapple with, including in communities of faith, as climate geoengineering is increasingly discussed in the future. Thank you.